it's sleepy in here today. Is everyone as tired as I am today? It feels real Monday-like, doesn't it? I actually think it's a little bit too warm. Yeah, I feel like I wanted people to be comfortable, but A, I'm chubby and don't like it this hot, and B, I think it's actually warm enough that it like makes you feel sleepy. Yeah, I'm turning the temperature down a little bit.
Let's bring back nap time.
No nap time. I mean, God, yes to nap time, but not during my class. What's your next class?
English.
Oh, sounds like a great napper. Yeah, I said it. Okay, thank you for the dramatic reenactment. I know, but I like to do a handwritten version of it as well. No. Oh, sorry. I'm sorry. No, because then people wouldn't understand it.
I would.
I love cursive. I think it looks so lovely.
When I look at cursive, I just think it's
My cursive isn't all that nice. My mother has like just perfect, just beautiful cursive writing. Yeah.
I'm the only person in my family that does not know how to read or do cursive. So when I look at it, it looks like another language.
Yeah, if you haven't been taught it, I mean, why would you know it, right? Like it's because it is. It's an entirely different alphabet, really. I mean, it's related, but it doesn't look the same. Okay, so here's what we're going to look at. Today we'll look at how we figure out the possible outcomes you can have when parents with different genotypes, with different combinations of alleles, reproduce together. So when organisms reproduce sexually, two sex cells, which are called gametes, come together to form a single cell, and that single cell is the new organism, the offspring. All right, and for example, you can have a grain of pollen and a plant ovum, and when they come together, you get a new plant. And it starts off as a single cell, but of course, what will then happen? After you have a single cell, I've never met a plant that was just a single cell out in the wild. I don't look at a tree and be like, oh, that tree has one cell. What's it going to do? It's going to grow into being a bunch of cells, right? And how will this cell split into a bunch of cells? By what process? Because every cell in that tree is identical to every other one. Every cell in you genetically is identical, even if they do different things. How does that happen? What process makes identical copies of cells? Mitosis, and so we'd end up with lots and lots and lots of cells in the new plant that are all identical, and that's how you get a multicellular organism. If you take a developmental biology class ever, you'll learn about that. And these, of course, should have nuclei, but I'm just kind of sketching here. So this is multicellular. And the process that made that was mitosis. Whereas these are made by the process of meiosis. which copies of each gene end up in each sex cell will determine the genotype and phenotype of the offspring. That's a big sentence. Let's write that down and then let's talk about what it means. Yeah. I am sorry. Yes, of course I can move. Sorry for being in the way. What does that sentence mean? Which copies of each gene end up in each sex cell will determine the genotype and phenotype of the offspring. Anyone here have a parent who's way taller or way shorter than them? Which is it? She's really short. And dad?
He's like 1 inch taller.
Nice. So like kind of put into gender terms, he's sort of an average height male, but you're like above average for a female, right? So an average height father and a probably smaller than average height mother produce an above average tall young woman. How's that happen? And the answer is, I mean, there's lots of things going on. There's nutrition and there's environmental impacts. But part of it is genetic. And what can happen is, just because your mom isn't tall doesn't mean there aren't some genes in there for tallness. And just because your dad is of average height doesn't mean that there aren't some genes in there for above average heightness. Does that make sense? Heightness? Just height. And so they are a certain combination of genes, but when they pass those along, they only give you some of theirs, which means you get different combinations. How are we doing? I have that effect, I've been told. I know, I'm only kidding. I know. You all right?
Somewhat.
Okay, let me know if you need anything. You need a cup of tea or water or me to beat up Destiny. Whatever it is, you just tell me. Blink twice if I need to beat up Destiny. Sorry, Dest. All right. Let's cut. No. Well, I was like, I've got a stapler, I've got pens, or I've got a can of diet caffeine-free Coke. What use is that, I would ask you? Oh, all the health and nutrition of pop without the energy burst. Okay, so let's talk about what this means. Okay. Face shape is in part controlled by a single gene in humans. With 2 alleles. And remind me, what's it mean to have a gene that has 2 alleles? Because I'm sure you've noticed this in biology class. There's a lot of language, right? There's a lot of like a single gene with 2 alleles. Well, a single gene means that on one of our chromosomes, there is this, section of DNA, and there's this section here that is this gene that is the face shape gene. Does that make sense? And there's 2 alleles. Which means 2 different versions of it. And the 2 alleles, they call one big R, and it codes for a round face shape. Like mine, it just kind of like curvy, face is round. More people have this than not, by the way. But then there's a second that codes for what we call an angular face shape. And what's meant by angular, if somebody has an angular face? A lot of straight lines. Those people who look like comic book characters? They got just straight lines on their face, like square-jawed. Yeah. So these are the 2 genes that contribute to that. By the way, so does how much water you're carrying at that time and your body fat percentage and all kinds of other things. But there's a genetic component to this. Looking at this just by convention, if you remember, Why did I choose the letter R for this and not S for shape or A for angular? What are they telling us by choosing a capital R as the letter we use for allele 1? Ah, very good. It's the dominant trait. What does it mean for a trait to be dominant? It takes over. That's right. If you have one of each, round is going to take over. What's the opposite of dominant? Recessive. Very good. So, you could have the following genotypes then, right? The possibilities are you could have both copies are dominant, you could have both copies are recessive, or you could have a mix of the two, right? If you had both copies dominant, obviously what shape is your face going to be? Good. And if you had both copies lowercase, the recessive, the angular, obviously your face is going to be angular. Yeah, sorry, I jumped to the end. But then in the middle, if you have one of each, what shape are you going to have? Round. And the reason you're going to have round if you have one of each is that when you have one of each, if there's a dominant gene, the dominant gene is going to take hold. By the way, not every type of gene has dominant and recessive alleles. Some just have, they do different things and you'll just have both. If you had one of each, blood typing works like that. There's an allele that codes for type A blood and there's an allele that codes for type B. And in that case, if you have one of each, you just have both. And so you're type A and type B, and we call that type AB. But a lot of genes are like this, where there's a dominant version and a recessive version. So, in that case, these are the possible genotypes and phenotypes. And I'll put that little here. You don't necessarily have to put that, but I'm going to use that word a lot just to familiarize you with it so that you remember it. By the way, there's a little bit of language we're going to get out of the way. When you have two copies that are the same, we call this being homozygous. And when you have two copies different, homo means same. What means different? Heterozygous. Good. Don't stress about the words yet. We'll see them often. But in this case, we would say that this person is homozygous for the recessive gene. We would say that this person is homozygous for the dominant gene. And we would say if you had this genotype that you were heterozygous. Again, don't stress. Don't try to memorize these words. The trick to learning to use words like these is just to use them. Just we talk our way through them. And I hope the thing I do where I try to talk you through things and have you use some of the language helps you to do that. I try to just model learning language by using it, which is by far the easiest way to learn new words. Much easier than sitting down and trying to write them out and memorize them. Is just talk. Just carry on a conversation about things. Okay, so let's imagine this case. A mother who has big R is crossed with. And by the way, what do we mean when we say they're crossed? Yeah, I mean, not to get indelicate, but procreating with, right? So a mother who is big R is crossed with a father, and the father in this case is going to be big R, little r. And we're going to say, what are the possible genotypes of their offspring? And first I'm going to show us figuring this out by drawing a picture and talking our way through it. And then I'm going to show you a more sensible, not more sensible, but just a neater and more tidy way to sort this out. But let's start by saying that we have the mother here, and the mother's cells look like this. Mother has a cell, and inside is the DNA, and she's got two copies of this gene, and I'm just going to show it that she's got on one of her chromosomes a big R, and on another one of her chromosomes she also has a big R. Does that make sense? So, if she undergoes meiosis, what are the possible sex cells that she could make? And of course, what kind of sex cells does a female human have? What do we call a woman's sex cells? Eggs. And the scientific name for an egg is an ovum. And the plural of ovum is? Does anyone know? Not oval. That's just a shape. Ova, actually. In Latin, things that have a um ending are pluralized with an a. So if you're pretentious, you could say, oh, that's a baseball stadium. Oh, baseball is played in stadia. Yeah. endings become a endings when we pluralize them. Anyway. That's why, when we talk about the media, well, media is actually plural of medium, and a medium is just a different place you can put information. Newspaper is a medium, websites are a medium, the radio is a medium, and together collectively we refer to them as the media. Anyway, you don't need to know any of that. So mom, when she produces her sex cells, her ova, there's two possibilities, right? Either that sex cell is going to have, and actually I'm going to use two different colors just to show that there are two different chromosomes. That would have been white. What the heck? Go away. I'm going to show her having a red and a green. That's just her maternal and paternal chromosome. And so when she goes to make a sex cell, either it's going to split off and they're going to get that red big R, or it's going to split off and they're going to get that green big R. Does that make sense? In this case, mom isn't actually making different sex cells, is she? Because she's got the same two alleles, because she is homozygous or heterozygous? Homozygous. Is she homozygous with the dominant or the recessive? Yeah. So because she is homozygous dominant, both of her sex cells will have the dominant gene. Or I should say, the dominant allele. On the other hand, so let's make that kind of I'm going to make this roughly into a table, where mom really has two different sex cells she can produce. On the other hand, the father, biological father, what color are we going to use for him? We're going to use purple. Yeah, we'll get there. The father, what is his genotype? Big R. Yeah, big R, little r. He's heterozygous. And that means inside of his DNA, he has got a big R copy and a little r. What's the color I haven't used yet? I haven't used yellow. Does that show up? That's okay? All right. So now, when he produces sex cells via meiosis, what are the possible sex cells he can produce? Well, he'll either produce a sperm. Ready for this? There we go. Oh, they're happy-looking sperm. Okay, that's good. I'm glad for them. And inside those, which just kind of look like balloons, I guess, not very anatomically accurate, but that's okay. One of his possible sperms would have that big R in it, and then the other one would have little r. Does that make sense? That is the worst little r anyone's ever drawn. It looked a lot more like an F. Let's try that again. Does that kind of make sense? Okay. So for this one gene, because it's on a chromosome, mom's either going to give this chromosome, which gives big R, or that chromosome, which gives big R. Dad is either going to give that chromosome, which is big R, or he's going to give that chromosome, which is small r. So now, not to get graphic here, but what happens if this sperm and that egg cell end up together? Yeah, sure. So we would have the sperm cell, join with the egg cell, and we're going to get them forming what we call a zygote. Zygote, which is just a proto-embryo. We're going to get a new cell that's eventually going to become a person. And what 2 copies of the gene do they have? Oh, why did I do the little r there when that is not at all what I just drew? That was silly of me. What 2 copies of the gene will this cell end up with? Yeah, it's going to have the big R from mom, but it's also going to have the big R from dad. There we go. On the other hand, what if here we have the sperm cell implanting in this egg cell, and now we have the big R from the sperm cell, but we also have the big R from that egg cell, and what do we end up with?
7.
Incorrect. Apology accepted. What do we get? Homozygous dominant. We get the big R from the dad, and we get the big R from the mom. And let's just write in these quickly. This particular cell, when it grows into a person, not just a cell, is it going to have, is it going to have a round face or an angular face? Round. What about this one? Yeah, it's going to be round-faced. Okay, well, let's look down here. Here we could have sperm cell from dad, which contains lowercase r, and lowercase r codes for what again? Angular face, not round. And that could be joining with this egg cell from mum, which has a big R. And when that happens, what's this cell look like? Heterozygous, which means it's got the dominant, the big R from mum, but it's got the lowercase, the little r from dad. Round or angular? Round. Why round? Yeah, because the round trait is the dominant trait. I should be consistent here, and I think it looks nicer with the lowercase. Not that one, though. That looks like hot trash. Okay, and then the final example. Again, we could have sperm cell from the father. And again, in this case, it's the version of the sperm cell from father that has his recessive gene. But it is joining with this egg cell, which is the version from mum that has its dominant gene. And when they come together, this also gives us a cell that has one dominant copy and one recessive copy. And if you have one dominant and one recessive, you will be heterozygous. And what will your phenotype be? Round. Okay. Does that visually kind of make sense, how we can figure these combinations out? Now, here's the problem. This, a lot of drawing. And you can only even imagine how much drawing it would be if we were trying to imagine not just looking at one gene, but maybe 2 genes or 3 genes, right? Can you imagine that would get really complicated really quickly? So we don't want to do it this way, just because it makes a lot of work. And we're lazy. I'm lazy. I don't know about you. Maybe you're not lazy at all, but I'm lazy. I don't like doing work I don't have to. But do you see the basic idea here, which is if we figure out what the possible sex cells the mother can produce are, and we see what the possible sex cells the father can produce are, then we can use that information to predict what possible cells could be produced for the offspring, what their genotypes could be. Does that kind of feel okay? So we're going to do this again using something called, well, the is more commonly spelled with an E. I just attempted to spell it with a U, but I discouraged that. The Punnett square. Can somebody check the spelling on that to see if it is indeed 2 N's, 2 T's? I'm feeling like one of those is only singular. Is it 2 N's and 1 T? Oh, this is right. Oh, see, look at me. Even a broken clock's right twice a day, crew.
So great, Mr. Ryan.
Yeah, so great. All right.
I'm definitely learning something. What class is this?
Biology.
Okay, I figured, I guess.
Yeah. How
Grade
you doing?
12, biology.
Look can I do for you, Novak?
A whole lot of nothing. Actually, volleyball. Are we doing it Friday?
If
This
people
Friday?
are in, I'm in.
Because you'll do it, right? So that's you, me, a whole bunch of other people, and a whole bunch of other people.
Get me a little more info, but I'm in. That's cool.
Boys, yes, no, depending on who, or just no
Ask a
in
few.
general?
No, ask a few, but
Like Rangers.
Rangers, yeah, you can ask my kid if he wants because he'll be here anyway. But yeah, but not if you don't want. Like, just pick a few, and people are going to be helpful, not people. Like, I'm not going to name names, but there's some people who aren't going to be helpful. You know who they are. I know who they are. So just be judicious in whom you ask. All right. If mother's heterozygous for face shape? What's her genotype going to be? Big R, little r. And a homozygous, which means what? Both are going to be the same. And we're going to say specifically that in this case it is recessive father. So how would I write that? Homozygous recessive. 2 small r's are crossed. And we're going to do the same thing we did above, but we're not going to draw any pictures because that makes it overly complicated. Okay, so here's what I want you to do. What we're going to do is we're going to make a square. And inside the square, we're going to cut it into 4 more squares. Like a 4-square board. Or no, anyway, yeah. You ever played 4 square? Is that a thing kids still play? When I was in elementary school, 4-square, do you know this? You can do it with basketball, or like one of those stupid utility balls, but we used to do it with a basketball. It's literally just like those 4 squares like this, and you stand there and you just try to bounce it in somebody else's square and bounce it out, and if you do, you... That was basically our life in elementary school. That was This is what I'm saying. Great sport. Anyway. Tall kid Marco. Settle down, Marco. You can tell him I said so. Oh, no. Kelford's room's across the hall, all right? Settle with the puns. Oh, he had a good one today, and I can't think of it now. I don't like to give him credit for his puns, because I think it only encourages him, but it was good.
My favorite one was a dyslexic man walks into a garage.
That's pretty good.
That was the one.
Yeah, that's pretty good. That's racy for Calford. Sure. Calford keeps it pretty PG as a rule, don't you think?
There was one that was really good. He said like last week. Oh, what about what is like what is a dirty a dirty like transportation hub and a crab with breast implants. A crusty bus station and a busty crab station.
That actually is pretty good. Oh, I hate to be. Again, it only encourages him.
Also for Sototoa is his little I don't know what to call it. This thing some old hippie caught another hippie shipping on house.
Yeah, well, that's the classic. That is a classic. Maternal. And then down here, we're going to put possible paternal sex cells. That isn't going well. I like many things about OneNote's highlighters, but one thing I don't like is you can't rotate them so they're wide, like up and down, which makes sense because obviously it's not a real highlighter, but it stresses me out. Anyway, that's okay. That's the end of my story. It's a good story. Okay, for consistency's sake, We usually put biological mother's possible sex cells on top and biological father's sex cells on the side. Obviously, if you don't know, if the question doesn't tell you which one's mother, which one's father, it doesn't matter. But that's just kind of by convention. So for the mother starts with big R, little r. Obviously, what are the two possible sex cells she can make? Either they have the big R or they have the little r. Does that make sense? Right? Could any one of her sex cells have both? No, because sex cells have how many copies of each gene? Sex cells. 1. Good. This is what we call a normal cell, or a, does anyone remember what the term for that is? Somatic, yeah. This is a normal cell from mom. And when mom produces sex cells via meiosis, right? She's either going to produce a sex cell that has the big R or the little r. Okay, what about dad in this case? He is, yeah, which means he has 2 copies of the lowercase r. So obviously when he produces sex cells, they're both going to have little r. Does that make sense? So if you have 2 parents with one here, if this sperm cell meets up with that egg cell, what will the genotype of this offspring be? Yeah, meaning big R, little r. What about here? Little r, little r. What about down here? Big R, little r. And here? Little r, little r. Yeah, don't just say R, right? Better just to say dominant, recessive, 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 dominant, recessive, recessive. You know what I mean? Because, yeah, I always get that. People are like, R, and you're like, that was not helpful. Which, by the way, does show a weakness of this naming system, right? That's okay. Let's talk genotypes. Or sorry, those are the genotypes. Let's talk phenotypes. What will this offspring's face look like? Yeah, a big old round face on that guy. What about this one?
Angular.
Yeah, big old angular face. What about here? Round. And this feller? Angular. All right. So now, the last thing we could say is, what are the genotypic, ready for a math word? Nah, you're good. What does frequency mean? Yeah, how often it appears. So for genotypes, in this case, we have big R as a possibility, big R as a possibility, or little r as a possibility. In this pairing, how many of the offspring of the F1 generation have big R?
0%.
Yeah, of the 4 possible outcomes that are equally likely, 0 of them have big R. And 0 divided by 4 is what percentage? 0%. Does that make sense? So, if you take a heterozygous mother and cross it with a homozygous recessive father, you will always get no big R, which the other way you would say this is this person is heterozygous dominant, right? So, 0%. What about big R, little r? What are the percentages there? 50. Good. How'd you get that? Of the 4 possible offspring, which are equally likely, 2 of them are big R, little r. And yeah, exactly right. 2 divided by 4 is 0.50. You multiply that by 100, you get 50%. In this class, not a math class, I'm happy with the fraction. I'm happy with the percentage. I don't care which. Does that make sense? If you like the fraction better, 2 out of 4, that's cool. You could even simplify that fraction. What does 2 out of 4 simplify to? 1 over 2. That's fine. I don't care. If you wanted to write this as 16 over 32, I wouldn't complain. It'd be a little weird. But whatever. You do you. And what percentage are little r, little r? 2 over 4, which is also 50%. Good. Very good. How does that feel? Not too bad? Does this at least kind of conceptually make sense? Right? We know that mom has 2 copies of the gene, but she can only pass one on to the kid. And for now, we're going to say it's always equally likely that she passes this one on or that one on. And then dad has 2 copies of the gene, but it's always equally likely which one he's going to pass on. Okay, so now let's talk about, if that's the genotypic frequency, how often we see each genotype. The other possibility would be the phenotypic frequencies. And there's only 2 phenotypes. There's only 2 traits we can have, which is you either have a round face or you have an angular face. In this case, there are cases where there's more than 2 phenotypes, but here we only have 2. So looking at our Punnett square, how many of them have round faces? 2 out of 4, which is 50%. Very good. And how many have angular faces? 2 out of 4, which is 50%. All right. That's the whole lesson. Does that make sense? Let's look at a couple other examples just for you to practice. So take your time, pass that off. But this is called a Punnett square, and it's a visual way of working out what the offspring percentages of things will be based on the parental. There is an algebraic method. If anyone's like, hey, I really love algebra, talk to me. Anyone here really love algebra? I love algebra. But I have been accused of being a nerd. In fact, I used to get called that as people were like shoving me into puddles and, like throwing things at me. So, anyway, all of which is to say, enough about me. Let's talk about Punnett squares. So let's go back to our friend the pea plant. And he is our friend, or she, or they. So when Mendel crossed heterozygous for color, which was, does anyone remember what the dominant color was for pea plants? Yellow. So we showed big Y. Does anyone remember what the recessive was?
Green.
Yeah, which they showed with little y. With each other, what were the genotypic and phenotypic frequencies? I think if you were going to start like a new wave band, maybe like a new wave ska band, calling them phenotypic frequencies would be a pretty good name for a band, don't you think? You get like shoved into a mud puddle. Have somebody like take your guitar and like hold it over your head and be like, just get it. Just keep away with your guitar. That could be your whole concert, is just people bullying you. I'm getting... Actually, I'd go see that concert. Just watching a bunch of bullies refuse to give your favorite band their instruments back, like stealing their lunch, stealing all the concert ticket money. Anyway, that has like performance art energy. Okay, so just a reminder, in this case, the mother plant is type what? Big Y, little y. And the father plant is also type big Y, little y. And what I want you to do is the exact same thing we did above. So I'm going to kind of zoom this out. I'm going to give you a few minutes. I want you to try this on your own. You can do it. You're smart. You're capable. I have faith in every one of you. But try it. Don't wait for me. All right? And don't wait for Matthew. And don't wait for, Jonathan or anyone else. You do it yourself. Right? Unless you're Matthew or Jonathan, in which case you can wait for Matthew and Jonathan because you're waiting for yourself. And then stop waiting and start doing. All right? You can do this. Just like we did up here. We put the mom up here. We figured out what her possible sex cells were. We put the dad down here. We figured out what his possible sex cells were. And then we put them together and saw what the possible outcomes were. So take that. Do that. You can do it. I'm going to give you, I don't know, what do you need, 7 minutes? I'm going to give you 7 minutes. And if you need more, I'll give you more. Sorry?
I was just thinking hydraulic plasticization. Does that sound fancy?
It sounds fancy to me.
Like an important job?
Yes. Nope. To what?
Guitar
Well,
Club.
get on it.
What we'll do this week.
I haven't been yet this year either. I should go.
Should I go grab the guitar?
No, you can do this Punnett square.
Already got it.
Oh, did you really? Yeah, go grab your guitar. Ah! Well, get up here. I'll be able to hear you if I'm going to play along. Also, you got to play something simple because I'm dumb. Oh yeah, simple. I don't know what key I'm in. It's like jazzy. It's gonna like change keys on me like 5 times. Yeah, the problem with something like that is you really need to know the chord progression because they like modulate, right? My batteries finally die. I'm waiting for this battery to die. I see the universe is telling me to be quiet and let you play clearly. And when the universe speaks, Joe listens. Yeah, it's not the amp actually. It's just this little guy here, which you can buy on like Amazon for cheap. And it's not Bluetooth. It's just like radio frequency, but it works nicely. I've been very pleased with it.
First time I seen it though.
Do the capo or not?
Almost.
I'm gonna try to change files. If not, you're looking elastic.
You also use the elastic and pencil.
Of course, of course.
MacGyvering a capo up here. What's that? Oh. Why do I not have a capo? That's crazy. Oh, here's one. In fact, I think I stole this from the music. Yeah, I'm a bit of a thief. I don't mean to be, but it does happen.
Barely fit.
Yeah, well, those classical guitars.
Yeah, they're a little light. I don't like these ones. I don't like these ones.
They sound so low.
They do. My guitar, the fretboard's too thin. This one's too wide. You see in the middle.
Yeah. Yeah, my hands are too small to play that guitar properly.
I love classical stuff.
I love the sound. I love the
Yeah.
sound.
It sounds so much lovelier. Feel like a nylon.
All right, talk to me. What are we looking at here? You listening to Fleetwood Mac right now? Are you listening to Fleetwood Mac right now? It's a very happy thing. I mean, I'd probably rather you pay attention to me, but if you're gonna not pay attention to me, which let's face it, that's a good choice. It's such a good record. I have that like right in this pile right now.
My mom used to play it whenever she lived with me when I was little.
Oh, I love that. Oh, it's such a great. Yeah, that's every track on that record kills. Like there's not a bad song on it.
Exactly. It's
Oh.
so good.
Yeah, it really is. Okay. All right, talk to me. So when we go to do this, we're going to do that same setup. And we're going to say, okay, we're going to make a little square. And I, of course, being very neat and orderly, will always make it very neat and orderly. You just got to be what you are, people, and me, neat and orderly. I don't need you judging me. Thank you. It's not like I judge you. Oh, wait. It's kind of what I get paid to do. I don't do so, like, negatively. Okay, so there we go. And actually, I wish I'd left a little bit of space. because I think it's always a good idea, if I may give you some advice, when you go to do this, always don't put mom. Like, this isn't like a tattoo. I could like put a heart, like a snake or something. Anyway, but what is the mother in this case? She is big Y, little y, which means what are the possible ova that can be produced here? And of course, we're talking about a plant here. But the ova of the plant, the ovum, I guess I should say, will either have a big Y or it will have a little y. Okay, and then in this case, paternal, all right, so the biological father in this case is also big Y, little y. Now, plants produce ova. They produce eggs just like, not just like, but we use the same word for them that we use for humans. But we don't talk about plants making sperm. Rather, what do we call the male sex cells of a plant? Pollen, that's right. So the pollen in this case will either be big Y or little y. Does that make sense? All right. So now when they form together to form an embryonic plant, if this pollen impregnates this ovum, what would we have? Homozygous dominant. In other words, two big Ys. I'm going to write that here to remember. So we use those terms once in a while. Homozygous dominant. What about if this dominant pollen impregnated this recessive ovum? We would get... Yeah, and we always put capital letters first, just as kind of like there's nothing magical about this, just kind of a manners thing. We do it's how we're used to seeing words, right? So if we have a capital and a lowercase, we do the capitals first. What would we call that? Heterozygous. Okay, what about this egg ending up with this pollen? Also heterozygous. For opposite reasons this time. In this case, mom has provided the dominant and the father has provided the recessive. But it doesn't matter, that is still a heterozygous offspring. And the last one, heterozygous, is if this pollen ends up impregnating that ovum, we get homozygous recessive. Very good. Little y, little y. Again, homo meaning same, zygous, in this case, it would be better if they called it like homoallelic, right? Because we're really talking about which alleles they have, or even homogeneous, right? Because this is a zygote, but yeah, that's the other word we have for this first embryonic cell, is we call it the zygote. So it's basically saying its zygote has two copies of the same, but it's still not my favorite. And this is homozygous recessive. And there we go. Let's talk outcome. If we remember, in case we forgot, big Y in this case is the same as saying they have the gene for yellow peas. Little y is the same as saying they have the gene for green peas. And we remember that this one, because it's big Y, it's telling us that this trait is dominant. And because this one is done with a little y, it's telling us that this trait is recessive. And that means phenotypically, what is this plant going to look like? Its peas are going to be yellow. What about this one phenotypically? Yellow. What about this one phenotypically? Yellow. And this one? Green. Hey, that's what Mendel saw, right? When Mendel did his dihybrid crosses, that's exactly what he found, is that 25% of the time, we would get green seeds from a yellow plant crossed with a yellow plant if they were hybrid plants, right? And so now if we talked about the genotypic frequencies, well, the possibilities are big Y, big Y, big Y, little y, or little y, little y. Talk to me percentage-wise. How many of them are big Y, big Y? 1 out of every 4, which means if these had 1,000 offsprings, we'd expect 250 of them to be big Y, big Y. What about big Y, little y? 2 out of 4. What percentage is that? Yeah, if we did 1 million offspring from this, we'd expect 500,000 of them to be this. And little y, also 1 out of 4, which is also 25%. Those are the genotypic frequencies. What's the other type of frequency? We can look at the genotype, or we can look at the phenotype. What does phenotype mean again? The appearance. And there's only 2 possible appearances. They're either, yeah, sorry, I won't do cursive. And how many of them are yellow? 3 out of 4. What percentage is that? 75%. How many of them are green? Which is 25%. Good. And that's what Mendel saw. Does that make sense? So that's called using a Punnett square to do a monohybrid cross. We'll carry on with that tomorrow, guys. Have a wonderful day. Be kind to one another. Don't do anything Matthew wouldn't do.
I would never do anything.
Subway.
Yeah.
Also, don't do